Welcome everyone to the first workshop in the MENA series of this academic year. We're very pleased to have Professor Sarah Griswold with us as our first speaker of the year. She's an assistant professor at Oklahoma State. And for today, we read her final chapter of her upcoming book, Resurrect the Past, France, Archaeology and Heritage in the Levant Mandate, 1918 to 1948. So this forms part of a larger scholarship, quite recent, but there has been an increased interest in, I would say, both the French scholarship and the scholarship coming from the Middle East on the kind of intersection between archaeology and empire in the region. So this is a kind of nice conversation between the two fields today. So we're very excited for that. So I'm gonna have Professor Griswold start off by sharing some notes and pictures with us. And I'm also gonna ask her to provide any kind of context apart from the very helpful outline of the chapters for us today.
Hi, well, thank you, everybody. I'll start with thank yous. So thank you to Eden for inviting me. We met, I think, about a year ago. Of course, everything now is meeting online, but she, quickly proved to be somebody who I knew I could talk to for developing ideas and resources. And so I was thrilled when she invited me, and I was thrilled to accept. I'm very honored. At my grad school at NYU, there were a number of students in the MEIS program who'd gone to Georgetown. So I knew of the program, for a long time. And I also want to thank Chris Sealing for coordinating the logistics and being so organized. And I also wanted to say a few quick apologies just in advance. So I have a wing of fraternities just this way, and it is we're on the other end of homecoming weekend, and they're deconstructing these massive iron kind of decorations that they've done. So if there's crashes in the background, it's them. And then I feel the need to explain the empty bookshelf behind me. This is actually the first time I've been in my office for any long period of time since the pandemic started. And so I've been lucky enough to teach from home and whisked most of my books off to my home office. So I promise I do have books. Okay, so I'm gonna screen share in order to show you a couple of slides I prepared. And then I will stop talking in 5 minutes or so in order to make sure there's plenty of time for your contributions and feedback. So I'm going to screen share. Okay, so hopefully can everybody see this? Okay, great. So yeah, as Eden mentioned, you read chapter 6 for me today. It's got a very long title. I think I should probably cut this title down, but it's, France, the Levant Mandate in the Museum in the 20th Century, the Louvre and Western Civilization. This fits in with the broader book project. So the broader project, as Eden mentioned, is called Resurrect the Past, France, Archaeology and Heritage in the Levant Mandate. It's based on my dissertation, so this will be my first book. I did my doctoral work at NYU in history and French studies, and I had Zach Lockman on my committee from MEIS to provide me with all of the kind of resources and grounding that I needed to take on this project. One thing that I could talk about, but I won't here, and I'm sure many of you know who are still grad students, is the trajectories that your research takes you in. This actually started out initially as a project on French archaeologists and the League of Nations. I was really interested in how archaeological expertise and the various agencies of the League were intersecting. I was really inspired by this kind of international turn that we saw in the first 2 decades, so I entered grad school in 2010, and that there was so much really exciting work out. But as I worked on the project more, I realized that first off, most of the French archaeologists who were getting any money were going to the French mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Most of the state funding was going for that. And I just became very interested in the French mandate for Syria and Lebanon. So as the project grew, it became really a story of how ideas and the actual materialities of the deep past got France into and then got France out of the French mandate. And it's I should be clear, I've tried to ground the project within these broader conversations in French historiography on the history of imperial and kind of global France in the 20th century. This is a historiography that's big and expansive, and the French mandate for Syria and Lebanon has largely been left out of the conversation. So one of my animating interests is to try to bring that into our broader understanding of how France in the 20th century reckoned with its imperial changes. There's 6 chapters in the book, and there's 3 parts, so there's 2 chapters per part. This is the last chapter, so I'm full of sort of anxieties and questions about it at the moment. I think because I've just written it or finished it, and it's the last chapter, so it's trying to pack a lot in. The part 3 itself is really about the French archaeologists and curators during the mandate's final years. And so part 5 is about biblical archaeology. Chapter 5 is about biblical archaeology. And then the chapter 6 is really, as you can tell as you read it, is grounded in the Louvre itself. So I'll just bring us back to the chapter itself, chapter 6. I thought what I do is kind of show you pairings of slides of pictures that I think visualize some of the internal dissonance, the inconsistencies and paradoxes that I found as I worked on the chapter on the Louvre. So I'm going to take us back to the 19th century to start. This is an engraving of the excavations at Corsabad, which is in present-day Iraq. But they were carried out by the French consul general of Mosul in the mid-19th century. And as you can see, this is 19th century archaeology at its most destructive. This is a picture of an excavation gone awry. Then this is a engraving from 1863 of the Assyrian Hall at the Louvre. And what I found really kind of interesting about this is, first off, how few people are in the galleries. They are dressed in finery. And so one of the key goals I wanted to get through in this chapter that you read was, to a certain extent, just how elite, reminding us of just how elite the Louvre was for most of its history up until the 1930s and 1940s. And of course, it's still a very elite institution in many respects. The other pairing I want to show is just to make sure, that we're reminded of the Louvre being in a historic palace, a really fussy historical palace, as you can see, this kind of ornate exterior. And the fact that the Louvre wasn't meant to be a museum, as I mentioned in the chapter, it wasn't until 1793 that it became a civic museum because of the revolution. And so one of the contradictions that the Louvre really struggled with, the curators, was how to maintain the building, because they were pretty clear that they didn't want to move into a purpose-built museum, how to have that fussy exterior and the confinements of the interior and still try to stick with the modernizing platforms that they were starting to embrace. this is an interior plan of what the Louvre looked like in the 1920s before the renovation that the chapter covers. I'm guessing, it's probably hard to see because you can see just how little many of the rooms are. One of the things I want to direct your attention to is the legend, and you can see that there are different entry points to the various wings of the museum. And I mean, there still are to a certain extent, but in the last couple of decades, they've really tried to control more how visitors enter the museum. And the 1930s was really when they made that first major attempt. There's these different museums too that are mentioned. So we have the entry to the Egyptian antiquities. Entry B is to the Near Eastern. Entry C is to the Musée des Marbres Antiques Grecs et Romains. So they were individual museums to a certain extent conceived that way. Okay, and then the last pairing I want to show is the distinction between how these artifacts were acquired in the mandate itself to kind of take us to the mandate in the 1920s and the 1930s. So you can see here below, this was an image from the Ras Shamra excavation, which is now known as Ugarit. And this is in the Illustrated London News. That's why it's in English. So it says thousands of tons of earth and stone were moved to uncover the mysteries of long buried Ras Shamra. One thing that I found really interesting as I did this research was the extent to which so much of archaeology is a chance of happenstance. It's, these, and I don't want to, of course, take away the fact that so much of it is also premeditated and has these narratives that are mapped onto it. But to a certain extent, what I found as I looked at the history of the Louvre was a certain amount of chaos. There was a kind of chaotic nature to the excavations they took on. Chance findings prompted large-scale excavations. And then what they ended up with to a certain extent, especially in the mandate, wasn't necessarily by this point in the 20s and 30s directed by the Louvre themselves. They were having to make compromises with their colleagues or the curators at the museums in Beirut, Damascus, Aleppo, Latakia. And so I found this interesting, this discrepancy between how much there was a certain amount of chance to the excavations with then this 1948 statement that's made by George Salle, the director of French National Museums, in Museum. And so Museum was the flagship professional journal that was put out by ICOM, the International Commission of Museums, which is also related to UNESCO. And you can see, so the first issue of Museum is in 1948, and it's all about the museums of France. And in his preface, he says, it may be said that the Louvre today forms a coherent whole grouping around our Western civilization, all those which had a share in its birth. These civilizations were those which from the beginning of history centered around the Mediterranean. At the Louvre, then, we are on our own home territory. And so what I'm trying to wrestle with in this chapter is this idea that I see happening over these key decades, that the Louvre is going to be a museum of Western civilization. And one of the key interventions I'm trying to make is the idea that it wasn't necessarily conceptualized that way when it began, and even as it acquired more objects over the 19th century in any necessary kind of intentional way. I think that there was this imbibed sense of France as a kind of avatar of universalism, but the idea that there was going to be this really upfront narrative that the public were given in multiple forms, that it was a museum of Western civilization where you could chart that ideas, the kind of trajectory of this idea of Western civilization, comes out of this fulcrum of the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, when France is dealing with both the challenges and the collapse of its access to artifacts in the Mandate, and then of course the sort of crucible in the 1940s when France falls during World War II to the Germans and is occupied. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've probably gone on a little bit too long and stop my sharing. I'll just say that in terms of where I'm at in getting the book out, because this might, is sort of helpful context. I'm trying to get it done for first review this year. I have all year off. So in the spring, I'm planning to send it for first review, and I've got a couple of presses in mind who've come out with some of the work that I have enjoyed most on 20th century France. So this is my first draft of this chapter, and I'm, going to be making changes. And so whatever you give me as feedback, I will be most grateful for, because I'm sure this chapter needs some tweaking, and I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm gonna start us off here by asking some questions, but before I do that, I thought I'd comment on kind of the importance past independence to, for example, Lebanon, which is my own field, of French archaeology. So in the independence period up till the Civil War, it's still called the Permanent Archaeological Mission in Lebanon. So they are there the entire time. And also this scholarship is very influential in Lebanon in particular. So I recently looked at, kind of coincidentally, the publications of the National Museum, which is in Beirut. It's an academic publication. It's usually annual. And an overview from 1937 to 1967, which is the first 30 years, it started in 37, shows that French scholars dominated this field. Even though it was published by the National Museum, it was published in Paris, not Beirut. And French scholars were over 2/3 of all publications, whereas Lebanese was only 23. Lebanese or Arab, I would say. Palestinian authors also included. And in that category, it was mainly Maurice Shahab, who you mentioned in your chapter. So very, very important to the history of Lebanon in particular. I can't speak as much to Syria as it's not my field, but of course important there as well. So I think there is one kind of tension between audiences here that we don't really see in this chapter that I wondered if you could address in your project as a whole, which is this kind of tension between how to present these, in some cases, very ideological narratives to either a domestic French audience or audiences in the Mandate Lebanese or Syrian. So I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of your project as a whole, if it addresses these tensions. And then my two other questions are more about this chapter. So my first one is not going to come as a surprise, I think, as a scholar of the Middle East. I wonder kind of about local agency here. So you mentioned two very important figures in Syria and Lebanon. So Shahab is one of them. For the ones of you who study Middle East history, you'll notice that his name is quite famous. He is a descendant of the Shahab dynasty and was also related to Fuad Shahab, who was the president, in this case, future president from 58 of Lebanon. So he comes from a very important family. So I wonder in this chapter, you have one example where he refuses to give the Louvre antiquities. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about local agency here. And for example, the fact that the Louvre funded digs were all in Mandate Syria and not in Mandate Lebanon, and whether there's a connection here. And then thirdly, again, as a scholar of the Middle East, I'm not actually very familiar with how the loss of the Syrian and Lebanese mandates were perceived by the French public at the time. So I wonder if there's a connection between this kind of new way of presenting these antiquities in France to kind of public opinion about losing the two mandates. Of course, they're not kind of as central in the French imagination as French Algeria, but I wonder if there's some connection there that you might be able to bring into the chapter, if at all relevant.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eden. I really appreciate the feedback and the good questions. So let me see if I can answer. Let me answer your last point first, and I'll kind of work backwards. The first question you asked is probably the one that I will have the most trouble answering at this point, which was kind of, what is the story of what happens in Syria and Lebanon after the end of the mandate? If I wrote down those notes properly. How the French spoke to the post-colonial countries, is that correct?
So I know a lot about how Syrians and Lebanese felt about the end of the mandate period. I don't really know a lot about how the French felt about it. So I wonder if there's a connection between this kind of new way of curating this history and kind of the French perception of the loss of the mandates.
Right, okay. Yeah, okay. So what I found that's really interesting, I think, in how the French perception is, I think I can, heuristically talk about two different reactions. One is the archaeologists and curators who are, really the kind of heart of the story that I'm telling. By that I mean, the French archaeologists and curators. There's a sense in, their personal papers and then in the pieces that they help put out in newspapers and in the various guides that they write. I think there's this sense of, trying to put essentially a good spin on it. They want to insist that their work in the region is not going to be in any way affected by not having the same kinds of prerogatives and priorities that they had, which just is, it's not accurate, but I mean, that's their argument. It's interesting that you pointed out that, in the literature that you looked at from the National Museum of Lebanon, how for years later, there's still this preponderance of French archaeologists who are publishing. So I think to a certain extent, what they lost out was the same kind of ease of access of artifacts that they'd had. But then, of course, clearly there's still the permanent archaeological mission. And then Henri Seyrig, who is the head of the Antiquities Service in the mandate from 1929, he stays on based in Beirut as the head of the French Institute, the Institut Français du Proche-Orient, so the French Institute of the Near East, until his death. So he remains this really critical figure. But in terms of kind of material access, that is circumscribed. And so I think there's the sense of, trying to keep up this appearances of success and of having this leading role in the region, which to a certain extent is accurate, and then to a certain extent has changed. In terms of the general public and what their attention was paid to this first loss of colonial territory or mandate territory, that's really interesting. That's something I've looked for, because the popular press, of course, I'm looking for it, right? But the popular press that I find through keyword searches shows that in the 20s and 30s, there is this there's frequent reports that are aimed at a public audience about the French kind of archaeological triumphs in the mandate and what they're bringing back. That is both written by archaeologists and written by journalists. And so I get the impression that people were fairly well informed. And of course, they often had to be looking for it. But with the loss of the mandate, I don't see that kind of public. There's not this sort of, public press about it. I have some theories about why. I think, for one, it was during World War II, and right after World War II, of course, France is, in the kind of throes of Reconstruction. So I think to a certain extent, there was so much other news that was on the front page instead. But one of the kind of other, arguments that I'm playing with, and it's a bit more theoretical than empirical at this point, which is a problem, but is the idea that to a certain extent, because the Louvre, and I try to show this in my chapter, goes from packaging these exhibitions in the 20s and 30s as about the mandate to being this kind of very sort of abstract understanding of the ancient Near East, where the mandate is basically erased from the Louvre. Instead, it becomes almost as if it had never happened, that you have these objects in the museum. And like so many museums at the time, there was not the kind of, there was no provenance that was really explained about how they acquired these objects. So part of the argument that I'm trying to get across, and again, I know it's a little bit too probably theoretical than empirical, is that the Louvre helps the French move on from having lost the kind of political and the easy material access to the mandate.
Would you like to address the other two questions, or should I move on to other questions?
Oh, can we move on to the other questions and then circle back if they're, at the end, if there's time?
Sure. Professor Astorita, do you want to ask a question?
Oh, hi. Thank you. Yeah, I found this paper very interesting, mostly as a lover, excuse me, lover and user of museums. I don't know much about the Levant. But I was curious, I thought it was very interesting what you said about the rearrangement of the Louvre's collection to tell this particular story about Western civilization. And I was just wondering comparatively, how new that was compared to similar sort of encyclopedic museums like the British or even the Met, although the Met still in New York still has also the known Western civilization materials. But I was just wondering whether this was something that was happening specifically with the Louvre, or if they were following other models or anything like that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So, unfortunately, I haven't looked at comparisons in this time period in the 1940s to see if, for example, there's that same kind of rhetoric and planning. But I can, two differences spring immediately to mind. One is in Berlin and one is the British Museum, in terms of how the Louvre, I think it's distinctive. The first is that, the Berlin in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s has this grand project on Museum Insel, where they divide their kind of former Kaiser collection, the former collections of the state and the Kaiser, into different museums. And so you have a classical museum, you have a Near Eastern museum. They're close together, so it's easy to see them at the same time. But in my understanding, there's not necessarily the same kind of progression that's planned that I see in the documents that I found for the Louvre. But of course, I need to speak to a German historian to verify that. What I found really interesting when I looked at these papers and magazines from the 1940s by the directors of the National Museums and the Louvre, is that they compare themselves favorably to the British Museum. And that is because the British Museum elects to remain like a really encyclopedic world museum. They keep their African collections, they keep their Americanist collections, they keep their Far Eastern collections. And the Louvre makes the decision to jettison, to demarcate those collections as needing to go to other museums. So the African and Americanist collections go to the Musée de l'Homme, the Museum of Man, so the Anthropology Museum, and then the Far Eastern collections from Southeast Asia, from China, Japan, go to the Musée Guimet, the Asian Museum. And so there's this really interesting narrowing of the collections at the Louvre, where, you know, as that, I think that quote said, like they're grouping it around the Mediterranean as this axis of Western civilization. And they see the British Museum as being, you know, far too sprawling and directionless. And so I think that's really interesting. I mean, that I don't make that connection explicit in the chapter, but it's there in my mind as I think about the kind of winnowing that they're doing in Paris at this time. To round out my answer, though, you know, I speak from as someone who hasn't actually looked kind of in minute detail at papers from Britain or Germany. And so in some ways, this is an impressionistic comparison based on what the French are saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have a question from Professor Cross.
Hi, thank you for such a fantastic paper and presentation. It's really nice to see you. I've got two questions, one of which is sort of asking you to sort of speak about maybe the positioning of the project more broadly, and then the second one is a much more small scale factual question. The one about the project more broadly, it's one of the things that really struck me and really intrigued me about the framing of the project, at least as it sort of came through in some of the material that you put in the early part of this paper, is that your story is really about sort of rethinking the last stages of the French Empire from these marginal cases. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about sort of what you see that is gained by rethinking the French Empire from these sort of marginal colonial cases as opposed to the more central ones, i.e. French Algeria, which was evoked in the first question. And with that in mind, I mean, one of the stories that sort of came to mind as a parallel case in what you're talking about is when in The Invention of Decolonization, Todd Shepard talks about how decolonization came to represent this sort of rejection of the non-West in terms of excising French Algeria from the story of what was France, what was metropolitan France, in order to remake this idea of France post-Algeria. And I was wondering how narratives like that have played into your thinking and what the Levant mandates might have to contribute to these kinds of conversations. And then the second question is just really a point of curiosity. I was wondering about the 1931 Paris Colonial Exposition and whether or not first of all, the mandates were even represented there. I'm not 100% certain that they were. And secondly, whether you see the exposition as sort of one of the way stations in the development of this idea of sort of curating a notion of Western civilization that was comprehensive of the Levant, and if those collections sort of play into the story at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's nice to meet you. We've corresponded before, so this is a wonderful opportunity just to see you in person. To answer, I can answer both these questions. The first question about rethinking kind of late colonialism from these more marginalized parts of the French Empire. It's funny that you asked that question because we just submitted our panels for the major French history conference. They were due October 15th for this April conference, and my roundtable is called Decolonization from at the Margins of Empire, with the idea being, you know, what can we gain when we look at parts of the kind of wider French imperial expanse that were not talked about as much then, and then haven't been talked as much about since in the historiography. And so, I mean, it's really interesting too that you bring up Todd Shepard's book, The Invention of Decolonization, because I mean, what I'm finding by what I think we gain by looking at this particular region mandate that I'm looking at. And then, the chapter that you read with the Louvre is, I'm trying to figure out the ways that, France, as it realized after World War, in the 1930s, even with anti-colonialism, growing, and then with World War II, what are we if we're not an empire? What also, if Algeria being such a, a sore spot at the time and since, what are the other kinds of pasts that we can look to and what our history, our past means to us. And so I find that, just in this chapter that you read with the kind of the idea that France is not necessarily a 20th century colonial power, but is a kind of 20th century avatar and repository of and leader of this idea of Western civilization centered in Paris, centered in France, centered in Europe, where European tourists, American tourists can come to. This is what my conclusion is about. Again, I think this is a little bit too theoretical, and I need to find, I need to look through my evidence and kind of find these empirical examples, or figure out a theoretical kind of mapping for it to provide. But I do think that the Louvre, in my argument, becomes this like site right at mid-century, where it's a French, national agency, all of its people are paid by the state, can reconceive of itself in the throes of decolonization as this kind of Western power. So I don't know if that got at what you were kind of asking, but I do think, also one of the things I find really interesting too, and this is something Todd has talked about, is the idea of making sure that we remember that colonialism, French colonialism, metropole, periphery wasn't happening in a vacuum, that there were other, other parties out there. And so, this is something that I'd done and asked about that I can loop back to, but, I did try to bring in Syrian and Lebanese voices, but I'm also trying to make sure that, the fact that Germans and Italians, Americans were coming and working and often talking to each other, in really high-minded internationalist rhetoric in this period, as archaeologists and curators. And I think, that is also part of this, my kind of unpicking of how French national identity was changing at this moment. Your question about the 1931 Paris Colonial Exhibition, yes, there actually was a mandate. There was a pavilion of the States of the Levant, was what it was called. The French papers that I looked at, they say that it's funded by this. There's a Syrian kind of section, there's an Alawite state section, there's a Lebanon section, but it's all one. How I use it in the book, I look at in the end of part 2, which is all about the kind of these projections of the heritage of French Christian Levant, and I have a chapter on the Crusader castles and their preservation. I end that chapter by looking at the Permanent Museum of the Colonies, which was part of that 1931 Colonial Exhibition, which is meant to be like the only edifice that remained. And the way that museum opened, if you walked in, you walked into a Crusader Room. And the Crusader Room was the first gallery, with the argument being that this was when French colonialism started, like the essence of France as an empire was the Crusades as the first kind of colonial mission. And I try to compare that, how that display is in the permanent exhibition, in the permanent museum versus the colonial, the Mandate Pavilion, which happens at the same time. The Mandate Pavilion is interesting because of course they don't make that argument in the Mandate Pavilion. That would have been offensive to, I think, the Syrian and Lebanese partners they were working with. And so I start part 2 of the book by looking at the pavilion, and part 2 is much more about the kind of bureaucrats who worked together from both, who were French and Syrian and Lebanese. it's a long-winded way of answering yes, and I try to till it, I try to make full use of it in the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question by Sarah Slingwell.
Hi, Sarah, another Sarah. I actually had a question, and this might not actually be the direction where you're going, but from the book, it seems like you're sort of ending in a more international space. So this is probably a follow-up from Professor Astorita's question. Like, do you see this project as talking to the ways in which both the French and particularly the British, like this competition between their museum spaces was actually like the mandate is playing out in the museums and their right to, and if so, maybe the South Kensington Museum transition to the Victoria and Albert is a better comparatum than the British Museum, sort of the process that they go through. And then a side note, and I don't know if you want to do it, but it sounds like the way you're talking in the theoretical talk. Have you read Carol Duncan's Civilizing Rituals? Because it seems like you're theoretically like dancing around that, and that you have a lot of really strong arguments that could be taken that way if you wanted to.
Thank you, Sarah. Are you working on the Victoria and Albert Museum?
No, but I do museums in Spain in the 30s. So this is really interesting.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, so Carol Duncan's book, I did a master's in museum studies, and so that's one of the first books I read when I started kind of down this track 15 years ago. But it's been a while since I've read it, and I need to, I think I need to refresh, because you're right, that would be an excellent kind of grounding for some of the ideas I've got floating in my head based on what I'm seeing in the archives. In terms of the, yeah, I mean, part 3 of this book is something I've really I've wrestled with, how do I want to end this? Because, part 2, it really takes place in the mandate. And then part 3 is I transition back to France. Partly, I'm trying to contribute to French imperial historiography. And I'm also very interested in the kind of international contest of museums at this moment. And so, yeah, I mean, I do see to a certain extent, this is, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, the kind of, the idea of this competition that of course is taking place especially in the early 20s, in the Middle East between France and Britain for hegemony, and that kind of idea of it remapping onto museums in the 40s. I think that's been lodged in my, in my thought process, that I hadn't really articulated it that closely or that well. In part because I did end up becoming so focused on France in this post-colonial moment, in this post-war moment, that I'd sort of forgotten that I could bring in the competition question, which is so clearly there. So yeah, thank you. I'll think about that, and I'll also I might email you separately to see if I can talk to you about the Victoria and Albert, because I hadn't thought about that at all as maybe the better comparison to make. So if you wouldn't mind, I'll write your name down.
Of course, there are not enough museum nerds out there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
A question by Professor Tucker.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thank you, Sarah. I really enjoyed reading this chapter. I found it very engaging, and it raised a lot of questions in my mind. And so I actually have three, but I'm going to try to make them really brief so that we don't, I don't take up too much time here. And actually some of them are just really elaborations on other things that I think have now been out on the table here. The first one really has to do with the single, the single analytic field that you mentioned, how we're going to study empire. And of course, since this is been a big question for that's kind of around, I think it's really good that you're engaging it, but I wonder if you could concretize it a little bit more. I mean, you talk about the Louvre as having a mediating function, as mediating the relationship between the colony and the metropole. And in line with Eden's opening remarks, it struck me that, I wondered if that was the best way to go to talk about it, because it seems to me also, if we attend to voices insofar as they're available, local voices in Syria, whether those be Syrian intellectuals at the time or Syrian museum people, or maybe even people at a more concrete level at the site, in the work crews and some of etc. I mean, so perhaps they are shaping what the Louvre is displaying and how people back in Paris are thinking about things. That it's not just a mediating role. It's the Louvre itself is being shaped and being created in a way by this relationship, right? So it's perhaps a different in emphasis, but it would be nice to have some, if they're available, some sort of concrete examples of this process. And my second question, which is related, is kind of the artifact as agent question, right? So certain artifacts get collected or not, depending on who influences the process, right? And then those artifacts in turn shape exhibits, shape what's available, inventories, etc., in the museum, so that there is a process of it's not simply that the French can go out and collect the artifacts that suit their narrative, right? It's that artifacts are delivered to them in a way that may shape that narrative. So I'm really interested in the sort of, and you may elaborate this elsewhere. Of course, we always have the issue that we're only really reading one chapter of a much larger project, but it would be interesting to me to hear your thoughts on, how the artifacts themselves are players in this history, right? And then the third more contained question, sorry, those two are not contained at all, but the third more contained question has to do with the Mediterranean, because I noted that you talked briefly in this chapter about the fact that the Mediterranean space comes back into the picture in this period, right? So I was really interested in hearing more about, but then you mention it in the chapter and then it sort of disappears on us. So I was interested in learning more about how the civilizational narrative, the narrative of Western civilization that you are arguing is moving to the fore at this period, how the Mediterranean does or does not relate to that, or is not related, because of course the Mediterranean did figure very largely in an earlier time, right? And is going to figure again in a later time. So I wonder what happens to the Mediterranean narrative in the 20s and 30s, this critical period that you're looking at. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Those were all great questions. Maybe I'll just respond to the first point briefly, because I agree with you that it's a more compelling and I think accurate argument to make that this is about shaping rather than mediating. And I think that, this is something that, Eden kind of brought up at the beginning, and you did as well, Syrian and Lebanese intellectuals, or potentially, trying to bring in people who were helping on the excavations, or who were, I have one case that I talk about in another chapter where there was a sheikh who I think owned the land by the Byblos site in Lebanon, just north of Beirut, who owned the land and didn't want to have to sell it. And so essentially the French kind of maneuver all of these ways to take it basically from him and expropriate it. And eventually they, with Maurice Shihab, they get the Lebanese state to pay like 600,000 francs to expropriate the land. But in an earlier chapter, he comes up as somebody who, even though in the end the French actually get the the Lebanese end up with most of the artifacts, but the French are really kind of trying to power that through of expropriation. I do try to show cases where there are a range of actors who are shaping what the Louvre ends up with. And that's one of the main, I don't know if it was a surprise, but I wasn't sure what I would find in terms of acquisition and how easy it was to acquire artifacts, being the mandatory power. It definitely was easier in the 30s and in the pre-independence period to acquire artifacts, but it wasn't seamless. There were antiquities laws that were put in place. There were people, who didn't want to sell their land. And so I do try to show that process, that it wasn't, a case necessarily of kind of open plunder. In terms of artifacts as agents, that's also very interesting. And I feel as I write this book, I sort of wish that I could have 9 chapters, but then I definitely don't want 9 chapters, but there's so much I want to say that in this chapter you read, I was trying to essentially tell the history of the Louvre, it felt like, in a chapter, while also bringing in why I thought the mandate was this forgotten, elemental part of it. But artifacts as agents is something that, clearly would enhance a chapter on the museum in terms of the material kind of properties of it. And I mean, one example I can think of is, that I can figure out ways to kind of work that more into the analysis and into the narrative. The Assyrian winged bulls, for example, that are in the Assyrian Room, that is, the foundational artifacts of that collection, of that gallery. They can't be moved. They're actually built into the walls. And so when the French, with the Verne plan, they actually don't want they would prefer not to have the bulls there and not to have the Assyrian Room there, but they have to have it there. And it actually messes up their chronology of the story they're trying to tell, because those bulls hold up the ceiling. So, figuring out ways to kind of bring that in, I think would probably make it entertaining, but also, the analytical kind of purchase there is useful to remember. Okay, and then the Mediterranean. So I think what I'm trying to get at there, which I can do, I can figure out how to do it better, because you're right, when I reread it, I thought, I say that, I have this like paragraph about the Mediterranean, and then I say, and then the war happened. And so then there's this abrupt shift and you never get to hear what they were actually planning. And part of that is because right now, I'm still not quite sure what they were planning in the 30s. So it's a bit of a feint, just to be very honest, in the chapter. I know what they say in the 1940s. In the 1940s, I think what they're making this argument is that, we're not necessarily a world museum about France and Western civilization going out and civilizing and colonizing. We are a museum about, how French civilization as this kind of avatar of Western civilization, this node on the Mediterranean, how we came to be and what shaped us. And here's this chronology where you can see how there's the kind of art and writing and religion started in this Near Eastern basin, and then gradually, in part because of Phoenicians, and this is their language, Phoenicians and Greeks migrated north. I think that's what they're saying in the 40s. That's the argument, is that you've got this basin of machine of civilizations and then this sort of trajectory, which isn't actually new. It's just the first time I've seen it as the animating ideology expressed by the Louvre, and putting that into museum guides. But just to circle back, I don't quite know, if that is something that in the 30s that they're also saying. It's something post-war that comes out. Sorry, I felt like that was kind of a roundabout way of getting at a really good question that I need to tackle as I revise. Thank you.
Move on to a question by Jacob Burnham.
Hi, thank you so much. I have two kind of related but not questions. My first is thinking more about archaeology and how this kind of process that you're describing relates to the development of like the social sciences in relation to empire at the same time, and what's the kind of discursive, recursive, whatever that word is, connection between archaeology and the ways that the Third Republic and the Fourth Republic are using social sciences and education to develop their kind of colonial habits. And then secondly, this is obviously a chapter about the Louvre, but I'm wondering about Paris museum politics more broadly. You brought up the Muséum de l'Homme, the Musée de l'Homme, and I wonder if this is something we see in this same kind of colonial museum policy development, or if it's particular to the Louvre, and if so, what that tells us about the way that the Louvre is starting to function as a historical narrative artifact within the French imagination at the beginning of the 20th century.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks for those questions. Both really good questions, both which I have to admit, I don't have the answer really to the second one. In terms of archaeology and the development of the social sciences in this time period, yeah, I mean, really interesting question. A lot of the people that I look at are archaeologists, are friends and colleagues with the kind of big names in French anthropology at this moment, and are corresponding with them on occasion. So like Rivet, Mauss. But what's interesting about archaeology in this period in terms of it being a science is just how humanistic it was. I have an article where I write about the development of aviation in the 20s and 30s, not the development, but the use of aviation in the mandate for surveillance, and how archaeologists tacked on to that. There's this famous flying priest, Poidbar, who becomes an archaeologist, sort of. I mean, he does some real work, and then I argue that is in some ways dovetails with the kind of emergence of the social science, of archaeology as a social science and as a high-tech science in the 60s and 70s. But in this period, it's very much, they see themselves as historians, which I think that, it makes sense. A lot of the archaeologists who I'm looking at, they're from the École Normale, or they went to the EHPT, like the High School of, I don't remember. It's basically a do you know what I'm talking about, Jacob? Yeah.
Yeah, I know which one it is. Yeah.
But it's humanities and social sciences, but they're very much historians. And some are art historians too. And so what they're really interested in, is history, and looking at this as historians. A lot of them start out only reading texts. They're looking for inscriptions, and to a certain extent, beautiful sculptures. I also don't really, one thing that I looked for and didn't find was to see it, to what extent they were co-opted or brought in by the Third Republic's kind of curricula, schools, to see if they were in any way involved in writing the curriculum, because that happened in other social sciences. And I didn't see that. I didn't see, evidence that they were involved in like history textbooks. It did seem like it was fairly an elite world that they worked in, at least until the 30s and 40s, when there's this impetus to try to make the museum into a social museum and to kind of curate the masses. And then your second question about Parisian museum politics more broadly, that's a great question. I mean, I have this evidence that I cite in the chapter that there was this effort to kind of streamline the museum world in Paris. So if you wanted to go see the, I think they use the word, other worlds, other to us, then you would go to the Musée de l'Homme. If you wanted to go to the Parisian, the French Antiquities Museum of antiquities found belonging to the Gauls, then you would go to the museum in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. And if you wanted to go to the, essentially, the Western Civilization Museum, you went to the Louvre, and it was a conscious, intentional streamlining. But in terms of connecting that to, explicit colonial policy development, I haven't found anything where the colonial ministry is getting involved in this. It's happening at this kind of museum planner level, with mass education in mind, and also I think with the idea of how are we going to present Paris to the tourist, and that's another important aspect of the story that I'm going to bring into the conclusion, because you guys probably saw in this chapter that doesn't really get worked in. Thanks.
Thank you.
Let's go to Jackson Perry.
Hello, thank you for sharing this paper. So as someone who does North Africa and not really the 20th century, my thoughts on this paper were more about the structure and coming to it as someone who isn't an expert in this, but more interested in what it was. So I found it really interesting what you mentioned earlier, that you felt almost like you had to tell a history of the Louvre in one chapter, and struggling with that for obvious reasons, right? Which is actually similar to what the curators were struggling with. They had all this material, and then they were trying to impart a message to it by the 1930s and 1940s. And so with that in mind, I was thinking about the title and how you were talking about maybe the title has to change. And I noticed that the title itself has changed from your outline as well, where in your outline, you say this is going to be about the curators to a certain extent. And then in the title of the actual chapter, you're more foregrounding the museum and the message that becomes the guiding structure. And so it's more of just a question, I think, for you to think about necessarily, and you don't, or we can talk about it here. Is just what do you want to prioritize the individuals because you have a couple of individuals that run throughout the chapter? Do you want to prioritize the message that they eventually land on? And which one of those do you think will be more useful to your historiographical contributions or to winning interest from a press if it's more interesting? And it also made me think about the structure in that you try to build the chapter around guided tours of the Louvre, which I think was a really interesting approach. And it is a good way of showing how what the tour is changes over time. And then I also started thinking about how tour has a tourism angle and a military service angle, which is appropriate for the mandates. But if there's any way, perhaps in the title or in how that relates to how you structure the chapter, I feel like there's an opportunity to be more, I don't know, committed to a particular focus on itineraries or people or an argument. Yeah, so those are just my reactions and hopefully useful thoughts on the title and the structuring.
Yeah, so helpful. As you were talking, I was just reminded of how lucky we are that, you know, we can have these conversations where we try to work out not just like our historical problems and our explanations, but also the craft of writing and structure, like structuring a chapter. So thank you for that. It's funny, a friend of mine looked at a version of this before I sent it to Eden a week ago. A friend looked at it about 2 weeks ago, and she also said the same thing. You know, is this a chapter about curators and the kind of curatorial practice and how it changes over time at the Louvre? Or is it a story about the message and, you know, how the collection, how messaging and kind of institutional identity evolves? And she said, you know, it's clear in both angles you're making an argument that the mandate matters more than we think it does in this, but I can't tell where you want to put your thumb. And after that, I actually took, after her feedback, I took a lot more out of the chapter that was about curating and curates, because I realized that I wanted the chapter to be more about the message, the kind of development of narrative, which I still need to work on. I mean, Dr. Tucker's point of kind of Mediterranean, like it still feels nebulous, kind of what that means in terms of Western civilization shows me that I still need to figure out what I think they mean. But I mean, that's what matters to me more. What I'm thinking, but the practice of curating matters to me too, because, you know, I think it's this really critical group of people who have generally not been looked at, and they're really, the Louvre becomes much more important internationally in the time period right after World War II. You get throngs of tourists starting to come to it, and the curators like believe that they have more of a curatorial mission than a keeper mission. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I still wrestle with kind of where to commit. I think for the book, I need to commit more to the message rather than the messengers. That same friend recommended maybe just write an article about the modern curates, and I'm kind of going towards that. But I'm glad. I mean, it's good for you for spotting that was still this sort of bifurcation. That's and I'm struggling because I feel like they're really linked. So it's hard to to pull off at this point. Thank you. Do we have time, Eden? Should I loop back to, we've got, you know, about 10 minutes. Should I loop back to your questions unless somebody else, because you had I think a couple of questions I didn't quite answer.
Yeah, I had 2 questions at the beginning. Before you do that, do you have so you showed one photo or illustration. Do you have photos of the exhibits?
I have photos of what they looked like after.
Okay.
in the Near Eastern galleries. That 1948 museum article or museum issue has fairly extensive pictures. And if I'm recalling correctly, I think there are a couple of photos where they show what it looked like before and what it looked like after, and you can really see how they've rationalized the collection. And then I also have, I'm going to try to get them in the book. I also have plans of what the museum looked like, the Louvre before and after. It's still really, it's still, you know, when you look at it, you have to spend a lot of time on it because there's 3 floors. And so there's, you know, the rez-de-chaussée, the first floor, the second floor, the third floor. But yeah, I'm going to try to get those in because I think it's hard to, as a reader, it's hard to visualize the changes.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get the rights, or, you know,
Yeah.
it's always an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to try to?
Yeah, okay, so it was the local agency, the question of local agency. That was one of the questions that I didn't get to, right?
Yes.
Right, okay. So yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the bigger, you know, challenges that I've had in working on this project. Notably because I don't use Arabic, you know, I don't read Arabic sources. So I'm depending on a research assistant who's great, who's been reading press for me to try to get a sense of, you know, what the local press is saying about, and you know him actually, Ian, yeah. And so he's been looking for keywords, you know, and trying to find out what the reactions are. And so he's working on that. And I have, you know, the next couple months to comb through that. Before I hired him, what I was, you know, depending on were the French archives. And to a certain extent, there's actually I wouldn't say robust presence, but there's definitely ways to understand what is going on at the elite levels, and then at the level of land ownership. And so those are, you know, sometimes it's people like the landowner in Jubel near Byblos who creates quite a file in the French Mandate archives because they're, you know, they're really annoyed with him, and he's really annoyed with them. And so I have, you know, that's one way. There's also some really interesting files that I've looked at in the Antiquity Service archives of people who are not, you know, famous, who are writing asking for permission to excavate. And usually they're met with a resounding no, like you're not an archaeologist, so you can't excavate, which is, you know, of course, like very frustrating to read, because then you have traders who, you know, Italian traders who live in Aleppo who are getting access to excavate. And so there's one chapter where I try to bring, you know, that aspect in to give a sense of the way that the French meted out, you know, exploited their rights to give permits for excavation. But the main way I can bring in the local voices is Maurice Shihab and Jafar Abdelkadir, because they are the 2 curators who have the most power and access in the mandate. And so, you know, for better or for worse, what I've ended up doing is having the first part of the book is all about mostly the kind of the French colonial lobby, who many of them are really committed Catholics who lobby really hard and successfully to take the mandate. And then the middle part is all about the I call them the mandate bureaucrats. And that is where I really try to work on the connections that were formed between Maurice Shihab and Jafar Abdelkadir, and then to a certain extent, at least in the case of Syria, Muhammad Ali Kurd, and then the French curators and archaeologists in Paris to see kind of how their relationships are worked out. And it's really interesting because both Shihab and Abd al-Qadir are the students of Dussault, who's one of the main characters. So there's this, really interesting twisted relationship, relationship that's very entangled. But I argue that they develop more power as the 30s proceed. They start to, say, no, you want us to build a national collection, so we need all of the artifacts. The law passed in 1926 states that we cannot give up any antiquities that would undermine the national interests, and we therefore earmark all of these antiquities as in the national interest. So I really work hard there, to try to understand those relationships. But then in part 3, I do move towards, again, just talking about the French, and I kind of go back to the metropole. And I wonder if that's the wisest choice, because it does leave open this question of kind of what happens in the late 1930s and the 1940s. And I sort of made that decision, partly because I'm trying to ground this in French imperial historiography. And so I really wanted to, and I've been really interested in, arguments about post-colonial France in terms of the kind of contraction of France as empires, they start to lose empire. But I also did it because I'm not a Middle Eastern historian with access to Arabic. And so I wondered how well I could really service that story. So, I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry, I've been talking for way too long.
Can I ask you a quick question? So I know that Shihab does write in French. Is there not correspondence with? So I've seen him sign letters before in the French archives, but of course that's not your time period, right? He continues to be the kind of main person at the National Museum in Beirut. But I would assume actually that his correspondence would not be in Arabic, but in French, no?
Yeah. So the way that I found a pretty thick file of his letters from the 1920s and 30s at the French Academy archives. That's where René Dussault's archive is. And since he was Dussault's student, they kept up a rich correspondence. And so that's where I primarily have managed to, locate kind of what his experience is and the questions he has and the trouble he faces. But that archive tapers out at the end of the 1930s. I think that's because Dussault stops being the curator in 1938. And so it might be just that they had, their correspondence to a certain extent might have trickled out, but that's when it ends. And so I haven't been able to kind of find, letters from him after that period. And I've looked in all of the French archaeological archives where you'd expect to find that at the state archives, and I haven't seen anything. I'm supposed to go back this spring. I was supposed to go back this summer and then couldn't because of Delta. But I'm supposed to go back with the goal of trying to figure out if I can find more from the post 1945 period. So perhaps to be continued. But it's something I think I'll probably follow up with you on. To kind of talk about, resources that I haven't yet tapped. I also have an I messaged you about it. I have funds to pay for somebody to go back to the Antiquity Service Archive in Beirut to see if I've only looked up to 1940. So that might also be where I would find And that was because when I went there in 2015, I wasn't planning on taking this project past 1939. So let that be a lesson to anyone doing research to always take as many photographs as you can.
Words to live by.
Words to live by.
So we have 5 minutes left. Do we have any other questions or comments before we end today? Nope. Then I think we'll end here. Thanks again for joining us today, Professor Griswold. It was a pleasure having you.